I took a night job at an abandoned mall because my family needed money. I should have quit before the first night was over. When Claire handed me the check envelope, bills folded so tight the creases had teeth, I told her it was just a few nights. Security at the Crescent Mall, I said, like it was a normal thing. The truth was, our savings had been scraped down to skeleton bones, and Ethan's toy list had more commas than cents. I told myself it was temporary. Feed the meter, keep the lights on, be back before Ethan fell asleep. The job was a few hours a night, the morning shift of the world I used to know when this place lived and breathed. Somewhere in the ad, the owner had written nostalgia site, occasional tours, and light maintenance included. He called it preservation. The rent guy called it survival. Crescent Mall used to be a place you could get lost in on purpose. It had a fountain with bronze dolphins, a food court that smelled like cinnamon and fryer oil, a glass skylight that, in summer, boxed the sun and made everything glow. When I first walked those corridors as a kid, the arcades blinked like a promise. The mascot, an awkward bear with one ear flopped, used to wave on Saturday mornings while kids lined up for rides. You could spend an evening there and not think about tomorrow. My father took me once and bought me a plastic robot that lasted a week and a half. There are things that smell like childhood if you stand in the right place and the right time. Crescent was one of them, once. By the time I took the job, Crescent was a monument to its own past. Storefronts were boarded up in the way of things waiting for permission to die. Posters for mall events from the mid-90s peeled like old tickets on glass. Mannequins sat like accidental congregation in display windows. Some still posed with frozen smiles, glass eyes reflecting fluorescent halos. Others wrapped half in yellow in sheets. Where the food court had been loud, there was a heavy silence that tasted like dust. The skylight leaked rain across a patched tarp that made the moon look like a bruise. They gave me a uniform that smelled like older men in chemical cleaner. The security office was a cigarette-stained booth turned into a makeshift control room. 3 monitors, a coffee ring etched into the desk, a metal key rack with far too many hooks. The owner had left me a pad of instructions and one nugget of actual history. A handwritten note taped to the wall above the monitors in spidery, impatient pen. Find Cedar. Listen. Cedar was a name that felt like a fossil, the sort you find in a box of things you thought were gone. Cedar showed up at dusk the first time like he belonged to the place. He was the kind of man who had the slow creak of the mall in his bones. An old overnight custodian, hair thinning, jacket zipped to the chin. His name badge read, Cedar, night staff, retired. He smelled of floor polish and mint. He moved with the certainty of someone who had mapped every tile and loose stair and the exact pitch of the walls when the air conditioning kicked on. "You don't want to be here long," he said without introduction, lighting a cigarette in the glow of the dying marquee. His voice had a lilt that stuck to the consonants. "Listen to the rules. They're not superstition. They're how people made it home." He handed me a folded scrap of paper, edges frayed like it had been hidden in the back of a drawer for years. On it, in a precise, ugly hand, were 7 lines. Cedar read them aloud, as if the words needed an audience to keep from evaporating. 1. Never wander the mall alone after midnight. 2. Do not answer whispers that mimic people you know. 3. Never show your terror. Fear is what feeds them. 4. Do not move the mannequins or remove the mascot token. 5. Respect the old center stage. Don't touch or clean it. 6. Never bring anyone else to the mall after dark. 7. If you must fight, bring light and a name you remember with love. He tapped the paper between 2 stained fingers. "They're rules for a reason," he said. "You break one, you give them room." I should have taken the rules as a man takes medicine, something unpleasant and necessary. Instead, I folded the paper back into my pocket like a souvenir and told Cedar I understood, which was the same lie I'd been telling myself for months. Understanding would keep things from changing. I wanted to look brave for Claire, to sound like I had it under control when I called home that night. It's easier to be brave on the phone. If there was a first thing that should have made me leave, it was the way the mall greeted me on that first shift. The overhead music looped, but not the jolly, programmed kind you'd expect. It was a memory of a melody, stretched and slowed, like vinyl that had warped from sitting too close to a heater. It played low, half-remembered. The neon signs hummed like a choir of tired insects. The arcade, where the machines should have been dark and obedient, had one screen alive, its static glow spilling like a lighthouse beam into the black corridor. The screen pulsed, and at certain angles the images looked like faces. I told myself machines break. I called it age and bad wiring. I set my generator checklists and made rounds. The list of halls I would cross at least once an hour so the motion sensors would know there was living flesh in their circuit. The padlocked doors were thick and heavy. I checked them, I double-checked them. I made my radio crackle and called the supervisor if something was even slightly off. But the mall has a way of making sound into a dare. On the first night, I found a crumpled flyer taped to my locker. It wasn't the kind of thing that gets left by teenagers or bored store employees searching for coupons. It was a child's drawing, the kind Ethan does. Bubble letters, a sun off to one corner, a bear with one ear flopped over, just like the old Crescent mascot. Inked across the bottom in messy block letters was a message, "We want you back." That's the kind of thing you tell yourself is someone's idea of a prank. I told myself that for half an hour while I sat and watched the monitors. The arcade screen flickered an image that, for a sliver of a second, looked like my own face stretched over the Pac-Man plumber's board. Static ate the center of the frame. On the monitor immediately to my left, the camera aimed at the old center stage showed nothing but a circle of dark. Then, for a foolish second, the camera glitched and the circle had something in it, a small token, dull and round, glinting like a coin. "You said don't remove the mascot token," Cedar had warned. "That token's been there since before my time. It's part of the show. People used to put pennies in the fountain like promises. Don't go handling it." Rule number 4, I thought. Don't move the mannequins or remove the mascot token. I didn't touch anything that first night, though I sat awake on the narrow chair in the security office with the flyer in my hand and thought about how Ethan's eyes would light up if I hung that silly drawing on our fridge. I put the flyer in my jacket and promised myself I'd throw it away tomorrow. Around 2 in the morning, the first dielectric laugh came. It wasn't a laugh so much as an eddy in the air, like a coin skimming a fountain and catching a sound that wasn't supposed to be there. The laugh moved through the vents, a tinkling of high glass, and I realized it was a child's laugh, maybe 3 or 4 voices braided together. And then, under that, something slower and older, like the last chuckle of an audience when the curtain falls. I remember the way my throat tightened. Rule number 3, never show your terror, kept playing in my head like a metronome. I tried to steady my hands, even though I wanted to move too fast, to get out, to go home. I stayed because staying felt like paying rent with the only thing I had left, nights in a place where ghosts could learn your name. The second night, the screens started to talk. Not in words at first. They showed things. A shot of the mall directory spinning until the letters blurred into a face. An arcade token rolling under a cabinet and stopping right on the camera lens, as if placing itself. On a loop, the center stage camera showed the same shot over and over, the same empty circle at its black center, until the circle framed something that looked like a pale hand brushing past a mannequin. I watched the hand pass, and I swore I could see dirt under the fingernail, like the hand had been digging its way out of something. I left the monitors on and walked the length of Corridor 5, which led past the arcade. The hall smelled like old pretzels and a humidity that had nowhere to go. The mannequins in the shop windows all faced the aisle, their faces turned in a perfect, frozen imitation of attention. I told myself the seams of their clothing had shifted. Wind can creep through a torn skylight, can't it? Wind that cold rattled the top of the skylight.
It shifted a display in a storefront, and one mannequin, in a borrowed dress from some department store that had been gone 20 years, had turned its head to look at me. You, in your chest, a private set of rules you follow. Don't make eye contact with a mannequin at 2 a.m. is probably not listed in any life plan books, but I discovered it that night. The moment our gazes met, I felt ridiculous and childish, then a warmth in my face that had nothing to do with heat. The mannequin's mouth seemed to be smiling harder. I took a step back. A strip of fluorescence above me popped. For a second, everything fell into an underwater dim. The mall music slowed like someone had thumbed the speed of a cassette. Rule number 1, Cedar had said, never wander the mall alone after midnight. But I had already broken it by being there at all. He'd also said Rule 6, never bring anyone else after dark. That one stays the most honest of warnings. I had told Claire I'd be home each night. Maybe rules are less about the letter and more about the way we surrender little pieces of ourselves each time we step into a place that wants them. I started writing down what I saw in a logbook I found in the manager's old office. It was a spiral notebook, business issue, with pages water-stained at the corners. Someone had written through the thing in a watercolor frenzy. Notes about the HVAC system, times the sprinklers glitched, a list of keys. Tucked in the back was a shorter note, like an afterthought scribbled in the margins. Watchers, they like pictures of home. The word watcher made me think of security cameras until I read the note more closely. The margin handwriting grew frantic. Voices mimic, masks of loved ones, do not give them your panic. Bring light, bring names, do not feed them fear. I read it 10 times. The more I read, the less it felt like notes, and the more like instruction wrapped in the ragged edge of someone who had gone a little further than I dared. There were other things, sketches of the central stage arrangement, mannequins clustered like choir boys around a low pedestal, a token placed at its heart, coins frozen in the fountain like teeth. There were stamped dates. Someone had circled the dates in red. The red had bled through the page. That night, I took my flashlight for my rounds, even though I had always hated the way flashlights slice the world into an amphitheater and leave the crowd in shadow. The beam was steady and cheap. Its batteries were probably older than the mall sign. I did it because Rule 7 said, if you must fight, bring light and a name you remember with love. A name you remember with love. The instruction felt like a wish tied to a balloon.
I thought of Claire and Ethan. I thought of Tom. Tom. I hadn't said the name out loud in years. He disappeared the summer before I graduated high school. We used to skateboard in the lots, jump the downspouts, steal fistfuls of quarters from a vending machine when the teen manager wasn't looking. He was the kind of kid who could make anything funny, who could make the air feel cheaper than it was. The last time I saw him was the last summer Crescent was still advertising a back-to-school blowout. We were idiots looking for trouble in the department store where they'd left the windows unlocked. Tom loved to pull gags, hide in dressing rooms, push the mannequins into a new pose, make them do things. That summer he disappeared, and the word spread like a rumor that he'd run away. Part of me later learned to be satisfied with that explanation, because it is cleaner, run away and be done, than the alternatives that live on the other side of not knowing. You carry people like luggage. I had the weight of Tom in me, folded into the pocket that also held shame. The night I found the logbook, the name felt like something I could reach for. Rule 7 said bring a name you remember with love. I could do that. Bring Tom's name as a lighthouse. Bring Ethan's breath as a weapon. Bring Claire's laugh like a shield that would, hopefully, punch holes in whatever lived in this place. The next thing I broke was rule number 2. Do not answer whispers that mimic people you know. Around 3 in the morning, someone, or something, called my name from down by the fountain. It sounded like Claire calling me in that soft, urgent way she does when Ethan rolls too close to the stairs, when she wants me to handle it.
I walked toward it like one step behind a man returning a borrowed item. My radio crackled and the monitors hummed a static lullaby. The fountain was dry now, a bowl of cracked tile and coins locked in dust. The mascot placeway turned to the side like a tongue, and there, propped on the edge of the fountain, was a small, dull token. I had seen it on the screen the first night. The token was colder than it should have been through my glove. It had an image of the mascot, the ear half folded, and an inscription around the edge I couldn't read by the light I had. It called me again. Not with Claire's actual voice. This voice was wrong. It had the wrong rhythm. It pulled at something in my chest, made the name I loved feel like a baited hook. I stood and listened. Jake, it whispered, the sibilance sliding around consonants like a snake trying on shoes. It sounded like the way I called Ethan when he hid under blankets. It sounded like a grocery list. It sounded like a memory someone had tried to stitch. I did what you are not supposed to do. I answered. Yeah? The token vibrated against the fountain rim like a tongue, and then, impossibly, into the empty bowl as if pushed by a small hand. My flashlight beam caught the place where it fallen, and then nothing. The beam buzzed and then died, the world collapsing to a single ring of light from the exit signs. I fumbled for the spare batteries in my backpack, hands suddenly clumsy in a way shame made them, and when the beam came back, the token was gone. Rule number 3, never show your terror. It is hard to keep that rule when the thing you love imitates you to get closer. I stomped back to the office like a child who's been found out. I should have called Cedar. I should have called someone. Instead, I wrote a report in the logbook, a shabby little alibi. Checked fountain, no trespassers, possible prank. I left the radio on low. I sat and watched the monitors until the sky outside the skylight turned the color of an old photograph. In the mornings, the world looks different. The sun makes everything possible to name again. But in the days after, the mall seemed to collect new small things, like people collect postcards from failed vacations. A sticker on a directory that wasn't there the night before. The smell of hot dog grease trailing through the maintenance tunnels. A flyer for a magic act taped to a boarded storefront with the name crossed out in ballpoint. Every night there was something new that should have been impersonal trouble. A loose wire, a breaker trip, a child's shoe. But there was intent under the things too. They were designed to make you look, to drag your hand into the pockets of memory until you couldn't tell the difference between what you had lost and what had been placed in front of you. A week passed or a night passed. I can't reliably tell which, because my sleep became a set of small trenches dug into the hours between shifts. The shop mannequins learned to rearrange their faces when I was not looking. I would return to a display and find the models posed in ways their plastic bodies shouldn't know. One evening, a tuxedo mannequin's sleeve was dipped in a way that made me think of a broken arm in a photograph. In the department store dressing room, someone had stitched a small, childish face into the back of a curtain. I decided to test rule number 5. Respect the old center stage. Don't touch or clean it. Why it felt like a test is the question you ask yourself when you think you are no longer in control of your actions. I approached the atrium cautiously. The center stage had been a mini bandstand once. Parents would let their kids dance to slow rock, and the local community college brass band would play Christmas skits. The stage was still there, a shallow bowl, ringed with dust and a faded carpet. Mannequins stood around it, 20 or so, their plastic hands facing inward like they were waiting for a command. I could see the outline of a token on the stage, some object placed in the center and lit by a strip of failing halogen. You should not have to make rules to leave anything alone. To respect means to accept that some things are better when they are left as relics. But my hands itched. The token on the stage was not the same one I had seen by the fountain. This was a pale, larger coin with the mascot etched in the center. Around it were fan notes pinned to the carpet.
dingy scraps with hearts and promises, names written in the looping handwriting of people who had sat on those benches years before. Some of them had dates. Some had "come back" scrawled. Someone had left a photo of a child standing in front of the carousel when it still turned. The photo was curled, its colors drained. Rule 4 said do not move mannequins or remove the mascot token. Rule 5 said respect the stage, don't touch it. The rules were a fence around a wound. I leaned closer anyway. My flashlight trembled. There was a smell like pennies and milk. I did something stupid. I reached out and brushed the edge of the token. The air around me folded. The mannequins' faces seemed to tilt up as if inhaling. The halogen strip buzzed and then burst, showering sparks that turned into dust. The mall music became a voice. Voices, really. Hundreds, layered and soft, like wind through paper. And then a face leaned out from the ring of mannequins. It was Tom. For a second, I thought it was trick of paint or wax. For a second, my brain insisted on rational explanations. A misplaced mask, one of the old promotional cutouts. And then his smile was there, that crooked grin he used to make when he'd pick the lock of the soda machine with a bent paperclip. He said my name like he'd picked it up from the other end of a phone. Jake. It took everything in my body not to say Tom, because the name has the wrong shape when you force it into a space it doesn't belong. The figure, Tom and not Tom, tilted its head, and its eyes glinted in the breaking light. It wasn't flesh. It looked like a memory masquerading in softer materials. And yet the voice that came out was his, stitched from years of me rehearsing how he laughs. It pulled at me with the force of shared jokes, old keys, and sunlight on warm asphalt. That's when the Watchers stopped being a story in a logbook and became something that could look me in the face and expect me to know what to do. The mannequins moved in a way I hadn't seen before, careful, small adjustments, like the easing of a body learning to breathe. They turned their heads to look at me, at the token under my palm like a lit fuse. The floor under my feet hummed, and from somewhere inside the mall, the vents, the loading dock, the old souvlaki joint, a tapping began. I remembered Cedar's words about thudding knocks in the old days. In Crescent, it came as the metallic pound of a curtain in the back hall, a hollow clack that traveled under tile and bone. Tom's eyes were wet with something that was not quite light. He smiled, and the smile made my chest ache in the particular place shame sets.
"You left," he said, or maybe I filled in what he didn't say and gave it the shape of betrayal. The sound of his voice unspooled memories. A late afternoon at the food court, a pocket of quarters, a dare to jump a curb. The Watchers use that unfinished sentence, the one with the missing "why" and the spare "I'm sorry," and they wrap it around you. Rule 2 came to life again in the voice that whispered, "Do not answer whispers that mimic people you know." The voice layered itself with Claire's laugh, and then with Ethan's small high complaint. It tried to fold itself into every place where I kept a tender thing. It called with the names I swore never to use in bargaining. It promised nostalgia like a drug. One more night, one more coin, one more chance to set things back to how they were. I did not run away. There was a small man inside me that wanted to, who could imagine the mall closing its doors and locking its teeth around the night like a lid. Instead, I picked up the flashlight and held it up like a lance. The beam cut through the dark and landed on Tom's mouth, on the token, on the mannequins. Rule 7, bring light and a name you remember with love, was a candle in my fist. I felt absurd but honest. I said the name aloud. Tom. I had expected nothing. I had not expected a surge of something like static to peel at my skin. Instead, Tom's face twitched, and then the mannequins blinked, plastic eyelids clicking shut and then opening, and the circle of heads around the stage leaned in like a jury. I said the name again, and this time I felt a pressure like breath on my neck. I could feel the mall leaning toward me. There was a sound like a storm of tiny coins pouring into a funnel. The token under my hand warmed up, and for a second it felt like a heart. But then, in the monitors, oh God, the monitors, images began to stutter. The camera by the loading dock showed a handy-yard door slowly closing, then violently slamming back open. On the arcade camera, a blue screen rippled and bled into what looked like a photograph of a small boy missing from my childhood. A speaker in the corner of the atrium squealed like a child who has been frightened too often. The mannequins rearranged themselves to face me with the polite assumption of people who have been waiting their entire life for someone to look at them and finally be seen. I should have left. I should have run and never looked back. But I stood there, anchored by guilt, by the shriek of recognition in Tom's voice, and by the flicker in the token, which was now thrumming like a tiny engine. "Jake, Tom, no, not Tom," whispered. "You remember the roof, that summer? You remember the stairs?" My lungs forgot what to do. There are things memory pries loose like meager shells from a deeper place. The mall reminded me of a night 16 years ago, the old stairwell behind the record shop, the way Tom dared me to jump. It reminded me of a choice so small at the time I called it nothing, a split-second decision to chase someone else, to leave Tom laughing in the dark, to drive off to a job interview and never look back. It reminded me of a guilt no therapist has asked to inventory. It offered it up like bait. The watchers leaned in to taste it. Their hunger is not for your bones, but for the small, private rot lodged under your sternum. They wanted the lurch that comes when you remember what you should have done and didn't. They wanted the trembling that names itself shame. I reached into the pocket where Cedar had left the paper with the rules and found, instead of the neat folded notes, a second scrap that I hadn't noticed before. On it was a single line. "If you show them what you fear, they will dine. You have to show them what you love." It sounded like a paradox and a dare. If the watchers feasted on your terror, then perhaps feeding them something else, some steady, warm thing, might make them choke. It felt childish. It felt like flipping a coin in the middle of a fight. But the mall was learning me in ways I did not like. It was only polite to attempt a defense. I thought of Claire, asleep on our couch with a newspaper folded over her knees, the small line at the corner of her mouth where she hides a laugh. I thought of Ethan making rockets with toilet paper tubes, of his small, freckled knee and the way he says "daddy" when he needs someone to fix things. I breathed their names into the dark like offerings, each syllable a small piece of armor. The mannequins convulsed like puppets whose strings had found new hands. The token slid from the stage and clattered to the floor between us like an accusation. Tom's face, less of a face now, more a pattern of light and memory, pulled closer, pleading. It was asking me to forgive him or to forgive myself, and in the same heartbeat it was testing whether I would break. For the first time since I'd taken this job, fear and something else, determination, stubbornness, love, fought the same place in my chest. I shouted Claire's name into the atrium like a command, and then Ethan's, and then another name, one I hadn't said in years, but loved with a clean, possible sort of love. The watchers recoiled in a way the cameras picked up as a blur. The mannequin heads tilted back as if recoiling from salt. The halogen flickered back to life with a violent pop. It was not victory. The token skittered under the stage like a beetle fleeing light. Tom's voice now was not pleading, but pleading with me to join him in the circle. The more I clung to the names I loved, the more the watchers twisted into caricatures of the things I feared. The face of a boy I could have saved. The look on Claire's face if something ever took me away. They pounded at the margins of my mind with a rhythm like a heartbeat I could not stop. When dawn finally leaked through a cracked pane in the skylight, it was like pouring cold water on a fever.
The mannequins slumped, corners of their mouths folding back into emptiness. The token slid to a stop at the center of the stage. The monitors obeyed the laws of electricity again and displayed nothing more than empty corridors and closed doors. The fountain looked like the bottom of a dried well. For a moment, the mall breathed like any other building does in morning, clean, banal, resigned. I stumbled out into parking lot light that made everything newly ridiculous. A man in a cheap uniform holding a flashlight like it was a relic, bearing the evidence of an encounter no one would believe. I drove home with the sun like a police light across the dash and wondered if Claire would see anything in my face. She did. She always does. She asked me what happened. I told her what I could. An old building, old wiring, a prank, maybe rats. We half laughed. We put on coffee. Ethan ran to my legs and asked if I had a toy for him. I wanted to hold him forever, and then never again, because the mall had shown me the kind of thing parents fear and leave unsaid. The knowledge that the world can pry at your love and make it into a weapon against you. I worked nights for weeks after that. The rules became an incantation in my head. Don't answer whispers. Never show terror. Bring light and names. Each night, the mall learned to move between those rules like a maze laster rewriting the lines. The arcade began to hum with a low melody that sounded like a lullaby tuned flat. The notes on my bulletin board multiplied. A photograph with a child's chalk outline drawn around it, a scrap of fabric in the exact pattern of Ethan's favorite blanket, a voice on the monitors that had my mother's accent when she called my name. Cedar kept to the periphery of the story, appearing like a stop in a dream. He would come in on nights I felt particularly hollow, and he would stand in the doorway like an old man looking into the teeth of something he once knew intimately. You can't bargain, he told me one night over the hum of the backlights, his cigarette stub glowing like a tiny lantern. They want you to bargain. They want your bargains. The rules ain't for you, they're for them. If you know that, you can use it. What do you mean? I asked, honest and raw. You gotta feed them what they expect and give them something else to choke on. He tapped the paper again. You give them your name, full of love, not the tremor. You don't let them make you small. They will bind to the thing you hide. Don't hide it. He eyed the token as if it were a coin in someone's palm. I helped patch this place up once, he said. Back when we thought the mall could be fixed. We learned the hard way. You don't throw a light at a shadow and hope it burns. You show 'em something that weighs more than their appetite. His words, meant to be advice, sounded like a map. Maps sometimes require you to cross a river. Some of the notes affixed to the carpet were written in my handwriting, which made me jerk the more because I was sure my own handwriting was at home on unpaid notices, not tacked to a public altar. The altar smelled like pennies and old perfume. The token was at the center, larger than I had imagined, dull and warm with neglected intent. Around it, the mannequin's plastic hands arranged like they were keeping prayer. The mall's looped music played the melody of a song I had not heard since high school. The arcade hummed in a slow, almost religious cadence. This was the place where the watchers fed, it seemed. This was the place where memories were offered up like ham to a dog. If they were feeding on fear and memory, then this was the table they used for the feast. I reached out to touch the token and felt, like electricity in a coin, the weight of every small regret I had ever carried. I did not pick it up. I could not. I had read the rules. I had broken some. I had survived some. But there is a difference between surviving and winning. From the dark, a voice said my name. It was not Tom, not quite. It was a choir of small things, the sound of someone who had been waiting to be called to a place they thought they'd never leave.
It called with the warmth of remembered summers and the wavering uncertainty of lost boys. I stood on the edge of the altar and did the only thing I could think of. I lit the cheapest flashlight I had and held it high, as if to say, "Look here." I said Claire's name, and then Ethan's, and then I said Tom's, but not with the pleading I'd used before. I said it with memory and with love, with the plain, flat truth of a man listing what he would keep if a storm took everything else. The mannequins swayed. The token did something like pulse, and from someplace dark, something laughed. Not the child's laugh, not exactly, but a low, delighted sound that meant the watchers had noticed the buffet and were now preparing their napkins. My phone was buzzing with a message from Claire while I stood there, light making a small stage of my palms. She had sent a photo of Ethan asleep on the couch. Ethan curled in on his side, one arm tucked under his cheek, a half-chewed dinosaur plush beside him. Claire had written under it, "Don't forget the bedtime story." The photo hit me like a hand closing around my throat. I stood there in the center of the mall, as if someone had lifted me out of my life and set me on stage, my flashlight a lonely spotlight. The sound in the atrium changed, not because anything new happened outside, but because I had named the thing I loved. Saying their names into the dark had been a small liturgy for me. Claire, Ethan, and now Claire's message at the edge of my pocket felt like a talisman. The watchers noticed, the way vultures notice the flutter of a rabbit. Something scraped against the underside of the stage, tiny, careful motions, like fingernails testing a seam. The mannequins' heads tilted, synchronized.
From behind a pillar, a child's shoe rolled into the light, tiny and dusty, and precisely the sort of detail the mall loved to produce. The arcade's single acting screen flashed the couch photo for half a beat and then began to stitch another image over it, Ethan awake, reaching for me. For a breath I saw his face, alive and wanting, and the urge to cross the stage and scoop him up was sharper than any fear. Tom's voice came then, and it was not only Tom. It had been layered, as if the mall were an old tape with all channels playing. My mother's admonition about being careful, a high school teacher's sarcastic laugh, Claire's soft reassurance. "You left," the chorus sighed. "Why did you leave?" I stepped forward because standing still felt like consenting. I raised my flashlight like a priest with a cross. The beam cut through the air and landed on the token at the center of the stage, where it sat like a heart. The token pulsed again, dull and warm. Around its rim, the fan notes were arranged like dry petals, names written and rewritten until ink had become an accumulation of grief. I thought of Cedar's words, "Don't bargain, don't let them make you small," and of the scrap that had told me to show them what I love. The logic felt absurd, a trick of superstition. But absurdity was not the same thing as wrong. The watchers had rules. I had rules now too. From somewhere down the loading dock, a metallic pounding began. It was a long, patient hammering, urgent and methodical. Thudding, Cedar had called it once, a sound that traveled through tile and bone. The pounding vibrated under my boots, and the mannequins followed the rhythm, their shoulders twitching like puppets on a weight. "Jake!" a voice called from the shadows near the back hall. It wasn't the sweet cadence of Claire's voice or the bright squeal of Ethan. It was Cedar, old and certain, and something else under his voice that rustled like a coat being adjusted. He was there with a jump drive in his hand and the smell of floor polish around him, as if he had brought an old body back to life. "You ready to break the rules?" he asked, without a smile. And though I didn't know whether he meant to encourage me or warn me, his presence felt like a second option in a room that only offered one. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice a hoof in my chest. My hand tightened around the flashlight so my knuckles went white.
Generator. There's a breaker in the service bay you can throw. It'll bring power back in a burst, lights everywhere. Make 'em see too much at once. Overload their taste for shadow. He glanced at the token, then at me. You do the words, you do the loving, I'll do the bursting of things. Isn't that risky? I asked. Cedar's plan sounded like trying to drown a fire by smacking it with a bucket of kerosene. All of it's risky, he said. You work here long enough, you learn risk is just another name for a choice. He clapped his gloved hand on my shoulder like some old locker room pep. The touch was warm and steady as an anchor. I had no other plan. I checked my pockets. Ethan's doodle, Claire's photo, the cheap flashlight with its half-dead batteries, and I thought of Tom's face. If I do this, what if it doesn't work? I asked. Then hold the name, Cedar said. Hold it like it's a ladder rung. Don't let them make you climb with your fingernails. It was an oddly precise image, and I took it like the map it was. Cedar pushed off into the darkness toward the service corridor. The mall seemed to sigh, like a thing relieved to have new motion in it. The mannequins' heads spun slowly, tracking us as if they were taking sides in a sport. I closed my eyes for a second and then inhaled the air I needed. I said Claire's name out loud, and the sound anchored me like a rope thrown to shore. Then I said Ethan's. Then I said Tom's. But this time I said it differently. I didn't ask for forgiveness from the dolls and the shadows. I told the truth I owed to myself. Tom, I remember. I'm sorry I left you that night. I remember how you laughed before you went quiet. I remember the joke about the vending machine. I loved you then. Saying it felt like throwing a door open inside my chest. Shame wanted a different phrasing. Quiet, small, perpetual. But the mall is greedy for the small, quiet things. If I gave that up, I fed it forever. Instead, I gave the large truth. I spoke the memory and the love all at once. It vibrated across the atrium like a bell. The mannequins shuddered. A dozen small springs uncoiled inside their plastic spines. The token's pulse accelerated, brightened by a hair. The arcade screen blinked white-hot. Cedar's hand was a sudden presence at my elbow. He'd found the breaker and slapped the lever. The mall's muscles tensed. The neon above the food court snarled to life in a chorus of buzzing and high note. Every emergency light that had been dead for years flared. The arcade exploded like a heart that had been resuscitated. Games lit. The old melody looped so loud it became a thing you could lean into. For a moment, the mall felt like it had woken, like an animal been roused from sleep. And then the watchers moved. Light is a blunt thing in the world of shadows. It doesn't persuade, it exposes. When the bright halogens came up, the faces that had been smooth and suggestive were revealed in the uglier detail. Mannequin seams showed repairs, the masks their flaws. But shadows adapt. The watchers condensed into silhouettes that snapped and shivered, like smoke trying to take the shape of a person. They circled the stage faster now, their motion a smear against the bright. Tom's figure, if you could call it that, leaned in until it was inches from my face. Up close, it had depth, but not the kind that suggested life. It had the sediment of memory and the grit of things left under a mattress. You were the one who left, it said. Not quite accusing and not quite forgiving. No, I said, and the word was a hinge. I didn't leave because of you. I left because I was scared of what staying would have asked of me. I left because I thought running was easier. I don't get to undo that, but I'm not going to let you eat that for me. That line felt like an oath, ugly and honest. The light burned sharply in my eyes. The mannequins' heads pivoted, then flicked back as if the bright had scorched them. The mall's music loop stuttered and then snapped into a high frequency that made my teeth ache. The watchers began to boil, not in the sense of a body, but like the air over a hot skillet,
shimmering and refracting. They generated images that slid across the halogen. Me as a younger man stepping into a car and driving away. Claire alone on the couch with a dozen unanswered calls. Ethan at a party table, gifts unwrapped with empty hands. Each image was a claw attempting to tear at the tether I'd made with my names. The watchers thought that by showing me all the things I feared, my family alone, my guilt magnified, my stomach would fall open and they would be fed. I had to choose what to let them see. I could not undo the past, but I could decide which memories were trump cards. So I traded. For every image they threw at me a failure, I offered a memory of love. I answered an apparition of Claire with the exact rhythm of a joke she made on some rain-heavy Tuesday, the kind nobody else would remember. I countered a ghostly montage of Ethan left out at a birthday, with the sound of Ethan's small voice saying, "Daddy, you're the best at rocket ships." The moments were precise, ridiculous, and utterly mine. It felt like naming a constellation, each tiny star arranged into a pattern that held meaning. The watchers recoiled when I made my memories into weapons. They swiveled, then lunged at the others in the room, at Cedar, at a mannequin dressed like a mother with a bun, at a stack of fan notes. They fed greedily on those things that were brimming with ache. But the love I gave them tasted different. It was not a quivering thing, but a saturated, heavy fulcrum. Something in their shape attempted to swallow it, and then choked. That choking was when the physical fight began. Mannequins stepped from their perches, not clumsy, slow motions anymore, but purposeful, sinewed. One in a tuxedo tried to cross the stage with the unhurried steadiness of a person who believes its movement is right. Another reached a hand, solid, cold, with a seam that betrayed where paint had been flaked off, toward Cedar. He parried with a broom, something so small it should have been pathetic, but the broom held because it had a person behind it. I grabbed the security baton from beside the monitor, 2 feet of rubber-dipped metal that had always felt more ceremonial than useful, and I swung at the nearest mannequin. It was like hitting a scarecrow that was half real. The baton connected with a thunk that felt in my bones. The mannequin's head tilted but didn't break. Plastics don't bleed, but the sound of it manufactured pain all the same, and the thing recoiled. The watchers transformed into many shapes at once. Some were curtains of cold that rushed the stage. Others were little faces that leapt into the arcade screens like pixels crawling toward light. The token at the center began to spin slowly, like a coin spun on a bar. The fan notes around it flapped like the wings of dead birds. One of the notes, my handwriting, I swear it, fell loose and fluttered to the carpet. I lunged to catch it. When my fingers brushed the paper, a cold shock went through me that was equal parts nostalgia and regret. The handwriting on the page blurred into a scene. Tom laughing in the food court, a slice of pie on his face, my wallet too heavy in my back pocket. I stumbled back, and a creature made of mold and sound reached for my ankle. Cedar screamed something that was not a word. He threw a spark at a belly of shadow with a lighter he had pulled from somewhere. The lighter flared, and for a second the thing dissolved like steam. "Light!" he shouted. "Keep it on them! Keep the names loud!" His voice had the authority of someone who had done terrible things and learned the margin of error. The hyper-bright halogens flared, and the arcade lights stuttered neon into the watchers like salt into an open wound. They screamed, not with a human throat, but with the media collage of every TV in the building being tuned to static. The sound threw me backward. I hit the stage edge and my palm slid across the token. It hummed like a stringed instrument, and the layers of memories attached to it vibrated in complex harmonics that made the atrium feel unmade. I should have taken the token then and run. Cedar had warned me not to remove it. But the thought that I could snatch it and break whatever magnetism it had came unbidden, like a child's superstition. I did not move to take it. Instead, I pushed my palm against the stage and planted myself like a person who has found a decision. "I forgive you," I said. "Not because I have to, because I want to close the ledger." Tom's figure stepped closer until I could see the seams of whatever lined him. He smiled. It was a smile that had been polished and then left in the rain. "Stay," he breathed. "We'll make it like it was." "No," I said, and there was no nobility in it, just an exhausted clarity. "I'm not staying to be a story in someone else's mouth. I'm going home." The watchers surged, a tide that tried to swallow the atrium whole. Cedar slammed against a mannequin and sent it toppling, the plastic cracking with a sound like old ice. I grabbed a fallen broom and used it like a lever to push back a sleeve that reached for my throat. Every motion we made felt small and enormous at once, like the flapping of moth wings under a headlamp.
Then I did something I had not planned. I took Ethan's drawing, the one I'd intended to throw away, and I clipped it onto the stage's low rail with one of the safety pins Cedar had in his pocket. It was a simple thing. Ethan's son, Ethan's ridiculous bear, Ethan's lumpy letters. I didn't bring Ethan. I brought his image, his small, honest, joyous scribble, and I stuck it onto the altar like a flag. It felt like offering a child's truth to a hungry place. The watchers reacted as if burned. They lunged toward the drawing with the quickness of something that had not expected to be denied its feast. The token pulsed wildly, and the fan notes lifted in a centrifugal tidal wave. I yelled Claire's name, and then Ethan's name, and then Tom's, not as pleading, but as a list of what I would hold on to. The names were a metronome, and the halogen a strobe, and together they made a rhythm that the watchers couldn't keep. The mannequins faltered. The shadows thinned at the edges. Cedar found the service bay fuse and ripped out a scorch of sparks that fed back through the circuits. The arcade lit up until it was almost obscene. Pinball lights, the restless blue of old screens, the red of an emergency lane. For a moment, I was a mote in a cathedral of neon. The watchers squatted and howled like animals that had been caught in light, their forms folding in on themselves. There was a particular pitched sound when the watchers began to fall apart, a wet, plastic tearing like cellophane. Tom's face cracked and resembled not a person, but a memory that had been taped together too many times. For the first time since he'd appeared, his voice sounded small and human. "Jake," he whispered, once, and it wasn't a demand, it was a reach. "Tom," I said, and I meant it in a simple way. "You scared me. I was a kid, and I got scared. I'm sorry, but I don't want you to stay here the way you are." The half-figure of Tom wavered. For a terrible second, I thought I had done something like mercy, like I'd offered a kindness that could salvage what was left. The token spun faster, leaking a light that seemed to suck the color from my arms. Then the light surged and the token cracked with a sound like a coin snapping underfoot. There was no thunder, only the impression of many tiny things letting go at once, and the mannequins slumping like people after a long vigil. When the storm of sound and light subsided, the atrium lay in ruined calm. The token lay split across the stage in two dull halves. Fan notes had been sheared into ribbons that floated like confetti and then dissolved into dust. Tom's figure was gone, or he had folded in on himself to such a degree he might as well have never been. A small child's shoe rolled to a stop and exhaled a sigh of dust. Cedar leaned against the stage and laughed once in a cracked, exhausted sound. "Told you," he panted, "they don't like being made to look at too much love. It's undignified." I crouched beside the broken token and felt something cold at my feet. The halves of the token were material now, rusty and unremarkable. I could have scooped one up to keep as proof. Proof that I had been in the belly of that thing and had not been swallowed. But rules were rules. Cedar's scrap about not removing the mascot token was not merely superstition. Part of the system was a binding. Whatever it had been broken, and the mall had been changed by that fracture. I left the halves on the stage like a relic of some argument. Maybe leaving it would keep whatever appetite was left from finding a new mouth. When I finally allowed myself to breathe, the morning was coming. Light bled through the skylight in a determined, indifferent way. The mannequins were stiff but unmoving. The arcade's light reels had blown fuses, and now only one machine blinked in a lonely rhythm like a heart trying to reassert itself. The fountain was a cracked glint of concrete. The parking lot outside was a spread of oil and asphalt and morning dew. The mall exhaled, like something that had been held underwater and was finally able to come up for its first true breath. Cedar and I shuffled through the corridors together, checking doors and locks and making notes in a notebook that already had too many entries. He smoked a cigarette and didn't offer prayer or consolation. He just lit and held the ember as if that tiny warmth was practice for being alive. He didn't ask me how I felt. He didn't have to. The way my hands shook when I folded them together said more than any words. We worked as if we might be called back at any second to the stage and called into the dark once more. When I left the mall, the lights went down behind me, acting like eyelids closing after a long day. The building looked smaller in daylight, its long face rather than its mask. I had the residue of night on me, the smell of dust like old paper, and the feeling of being looked at. My chest held a pain that was not entirely fear. It was the ache of someone who has wrestled with shame and found they could still, with effort and stubbornness, hold something they loved up against it. I drove home with the windows down, though the air was cold, and I watched the highway drink the sun. The town woke up like a congregation pulling up chairs. People with coffee and dog leashes nodded, sleep-heavy and ordinary, as if the city had gone on being itself, untroubled by the atrium's private apocalypse. Claire was still in bed when I pushed open the door. Ethan met me in the hallway with his hair all mussed and a small paper crown crooked on his head from some breakfast celebration. He ran into my legs and wrapped his arms around my knees like a belt. "Daddy," he said, and for a moment the world narrowed into a perfect, ridiculous point. I crouched down and held him until his small heartbeat thudded against my hand. "Did you get a toy?" he asked, already shifting into the economy of asking. "No," I said, and it sounded like a confession so small it would be swallowed whole. He looked at me like the world made room for just our own little economy of truth, and I liked him for it. I kissed his forehead. Claire watched from the kitchen doorway, one hand on the counter like a sailor needing a rail. "You look like you've done hard labor," she said, and her half-joke held concern underneath. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said, "just a long night." She didn't press. She knows the shape my secrets take. Couples who have been through too many bills tend to learn where the thin places are. She made coffee and let me sit with a mug like a small island for an hour. I told her a story that was part truth and part what a person does to keep people calm. Old wiring, a prank, a crazy ex-employee. She let the line stay where it was and didn't chase the edges. At breakfast, Ethan showed me a drawing he'd made at school, more rockets, and asked me to tape it to the fridge. At the moment my fingers touched the corner of the paper, the memory of the atrium's altar flared up and then slid away like a tide pulled back. The mall had not been completely reset. The token halves were still arranged on the stage. The mannequins still filled windows like statues that had forgotten to be decorative. But the pressure that had been tightening around the chest eased. In the days that followed, the mall grew quieter. Not peaceful, quiet in a way that suggested an organ that had been bruised and was now sleeping, but quieter nonetheless. Reports came in sometimes. Lights flicker at night on the third floor. A shopper glimpsed a child sitting on a bench who disappeared when they called out. Rumors spooled and rewound in the local coffee shops. A few teenagers dared each other to creep close to the chain-link fencing and take photos. The kind of people who like ruined places circled it like birds. I kept working the night shift for a while longer, not because I liked it, but because we needed the money and because sometimes bravery is not one bold morning, but a string of small, fatigued decisions. For weeks after the altar incident, I would do my rounds with the flashlight and a notebook and the rules sewn into the inside of my skull. Rule 1, never wander after midnight, felt more like a guideline after the thing I had done. Rule 2, don't answer whispers, was now a mantra. Rule 3, don't show terror, remained the hardest. Rule 4, do not move the mannequins or remove the mascot token, was a relic I treated like a sacred text. Though the halves lay broken, I did not try to assemble them. Rule 5, respect the old center stage, was a warning I finally understood as mercy. Rule 6, never bring anyone else, was not something I'd consider breaking again. And Rule 7, bring light and a name you remember with love, became less a desperate tactic and more of a daily practice.
Cedar kept coming by on occasion, leaning into the doorway of the security office like an old man who had found a hobby he could not resist. He talked less about the watchers and more about the map of the building, the places where the floorboard had the soft give, the panel in the maintenance room that never really locked. Occasionally he would tap a cigarette against his thumb and say, "They like memories, they like names. You gave them something else. Good work, lad." It was the kind of compliment that tastes like coal but means something solid. People asked if I'd had help. Did I have some psychic training, some priest to bless the altar? Did someone break in and vandalize the place to clear out a nest of squatters? I smiled and said no more than was necessary. Certain facts are professional privileges, the price of living in a world that does not require explanation for every scar. Tom's absence continued to reverberate in me, which is to say, some parts of the world were raw and would not knit in a hurry. I carried guilt like a coat that hung at my shoulders. But guilt no longer ran the house. It could sit quiet in a closet. I went to work and came home and read Ethan books until my throat was hoarse, and then read them again. I kissed Claire in the doorway and sometimes told her about nothing, movies, the grocery list, until she laughed like a bell. Little domestic things became the heroic acts they are, making sure the bills were paid, taking the trash out so Claire didn't have to, being the person who turned the bed toward rest instead of retreat. One afternoon, months later, Cedar did not come by to the office. He had a birthday card on the security counter with a cantankerous scrawl that read, "Don't make the same mistakes I did." I left it there and added a quarter on top, an offering of small value that felt more valuable than any money. The mall hummed like a thing that has been shook up and is thinking about its new shape. The watchers didn't vanish. I knew that because sometimes a camera would catch something that made me catch my breath. An extra reflection in a glass, a pair of hands in a window that belonged to no arms. But they were quieter. They'd been taught an embarrassing lesson. Love is not a weak dish to serve at their table. It is a thing that can choke them as well as sadden them. If you make the choice to hold love up as something not negotiable, they don't know how to eat that. On the day of Ethan's birthday, I took a half day from work. Claire and I wrapped cheap gifts and made a cake with store-bought frosting that was too sweet by half, and Ethan ran around wearing his paper crown like a small, bright governor. At dusk, I kissed Claire under the porch light and told her I loved her, and this time the words came without the undercurrent of fear. I had been in the dark and come back carrying pieces of it, but when the light hit my face, I could see lines where something had been earned, not stolen.
Sometimes at night, from the window, I would watch the mall's silhouette on the edge of town. It was a big, dumb thing, glass and concrete and neon bones, and it looked lonelier at some angles and less so at others. I would think of Tom and the boy he had been, and of all the boys and girls and store clerks and carnival families that had left little marks there, a sticker on a directory, a child's drawing on a board. I would think of the altar and how fragile it was,
And then I would think of the way the mall had almost managed to make my love into a thing I could name, carry, and then use to stand again. I never told Ethan the details. Why risk the small, true, brave things becoming tales that could sprout claws? He didn't need to know about the token, about broken plastic, about mannequins. He needed to know that I came home, that I put his drawings on the fridge, that I would be at his games. Those were enough to build a life. Sometimes, when the house was quiet and the fan in Ethan's room hummed like a small, patient engine, I would whisper the list of rules under my breath, like a return prayer. I'd say them and feel them fall into place. Don't wander. Don't answer. Don't show terror. Don't move or remove. Respect the stage. Don't bring others. Bring light and names. The list was less a binding now and more a memory of how to hold a line. At night, when Claire burned the last coffee grounds and the porch light gave a thin halo, I would go to the window and glance toward the Crescent Mall. Sometimes, in the distance, I thought I saw lights flicker even when I knew there should be no one there. Sometimes the arcade's lone machine called with a tiny electronic note that sounded almost like laughter, and then fell quiet. I would drink in the sight, and then turn to the people who needed me. The watchers were still out there, perhaps always going to be, but they had learned, in a way that I could understand, that the meal they preferred, fear, was no longer on the menu here. If you ask me whether I should have quit sooner, there is a simple answer: yes. If you ask me whether I would have done it differently, I would say I do not know. We are the sum of the choices we make when the world bends its light in strange ways. I chose to hold love up as a weapon and a shield, clumsy and blunt and honest. It did not erase the world's cruelties. It bought us time. It left a scar on the mall and on me. It left the watchers with less appetite for my small children's sounds. The day I handed in my resignation, the security office was quiet. The monitors showed empty corridors, like open palms. I thumbed the scrap of paper Cedar had given me, the one with the rules, now frayed at the edges and folded in ways that felt like muscle memory. I tucked it into my wallet. Cedar nodded at me, like a man who knew I'd kept something important. "Don't forget to say their names," he said. And for once, it was not a joke. It was direction. I left the mall with my uniform bag heavier than when I had first taken the shift, my hands a little more steady for the things I hadn't known how to hold. The parking lot sun poured across the asphalt, and for a second everything looked simple: a man, a bag, a road. I thought of the altar and the token halves, of the mannequins and Tom and Cedar, and the cheap flashlight that had felt like a holy thing in my fist. I thought about home and the small flat altar we keep there, Ethan's drawings tacked to the fridge, the little robot he could never make live forever. And I felt like someone who had been given a second chance to be small and really be there for it. You can tell this story and people will imagine grand exorcisms or cinematic finales, but the truth is messier and quieter. My victory, if you want to call it that, was not a conquest so much as a refusal to be eaten. I refused to let the watchers have the thing that made me human. I used light and names, and I learned that sometimes light is not a weapon so much as a language. You can speak it to the dark and expect the dark to answer differently. Do I think the Crescent Mall is safe now? No. Do I think the watchers are gone for good? No. They are like rust. They will come back in small ways if someone forgets the rules. But I think now that there are a few fewer hungry things in the world. And for my family, for Claire and Ethan, that is enough. If you want more stories like this, long, slow-burn nightmares that taste like childhood and dust, subscribe. And if you have a theory about what the watchers truly are, leave it in the comments. I still like to read them, even now, when the lights are off and the house is asleep. The Crescent Mall sits at the edge of town like an old memory. Sometimes at night, when headlights slide across its windows, I can see the outline of the stage. Sometimes I think I see a silhouette move, but it is probably only a shadow. The malls of our lives never fully empty. I go to bed with my hand on Claire's back and Ethan's toy within reach. I sleep with the list of rules folded in my wallet, and the knowledge that when the world looks at you with a face you recognize,
You don't always have to answer as if it were hungry. You can answer with names. You can answer with light. You can go home.